too. Now, there is one voice that journalists like me and many others consistently, when we're looking for somebody to speak with authority and with credibility in this intersection between environment and food production, always end up turning to. A man who is so authoritative that he managed to calm a massive row remotely from Copenhagen that was taking place here last week with a single op-ed piece in the Irish Times. Can I introduce to you now, please, this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to speak to this key question of what CAP 2022 holds for us, the Professor of Modern European Agriculture, so to speak, from Trinity, Emeritus Professor from Trinity College Dublin, Professor Alan Matthews. Good afternoon, Alan.
Good afternoon, Philip.
So, do you want to give us your presentation and then we'll throw a few questions to you as they arise afterwards?
I'd be very happy to do so. It was terrific listening to Christine just now. She's a very hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. And I'm going to change the topic somewhat. Let me see if I can just get that fully open on the screen. Whoops. Yeah. Does that look okay to you now, Philip? I was asked to talk a little bit about how the new CAP is going to impact on farmers and the future. And I'd like to just put my remarks in the context of the European Union vision for the future food system, as the Minister has already referred to. And of course, also the important news of the Ireland's Climate Action Plan, which was launched last week. And then into the nitty-gritty of what to expect in the CAP after 2022. And I think the question we want to try to keep in our mind throughout this presentation is, what are the opportunities in the new CAP to support the transition to a more sustainable agricultural sector, and how can Ireland make the best use of them? And obviously, in the time available, I'll be only able to give a fairly high-level view. There will be, I suspect, more detailed specifics provided by some other speakers, and in particular, I'm looking forward to hearing Jack Nolan from the Department on Nature and Agriculture later on this afternoon. The new CAP has had a long and difficult gestation period. In fact, it's exactly 4 years ago to this month that the Commission launched the process with a white paper on the future of food and farming. It then published its draft legislative proposals. We had a new Commission which came forward with the European Green Deal. We needed to wait for the European Council to reach agreement on the multi-annual European budget. That delayed things so long, we had to extend the current CAP rules for a further 2 years. And eventually we reached political agreement on the CAP in July of this year. And the hope is that the new CAP will enter into force on the 1st of January 2023. Now, the European Growth Strategy is proposed as the flagship growth strategy by the incoming European Commission. And its headline ambition is, of course, that the EU should become a climate neutral continent by 2050, so zero net emissions. But there are also accompanying commitments to zero pollution, decoupling economic growth from resource use, building a circular economy, and protection and enhancement of natural capital. And the Green Deal sees a central role for agriculture and food systems in this transition. So some quotations: there's a need to rethink policies for agriculture, transformational change is needed, a shift to a sustainable food system, and ensuring a sustainable livelihood for primary producers. It also goes on to say that there's an urgent need to reduce dependency on pesticides and antimicrobials, to reduce excess fertilization, to increase organic farming, improve animal welfare, and reverse biodiversity loss. So this vision of the European Green Deal is then implemented through a set of strategies and targets. And in particular, we've already have the European Climate Law, which enshrines the goal of zero net emissions by 2050 into law. and has also raised the ambition of the 2030 target from a 40% reduction to a net 55% reduction in emissions compared to 1990. And since then, the Commission has published its so-called Fit for 55 package, which is a really comprehensive suite of legislation designed to update its climate architecture to achieve these more ambitious targets. And it will have important implications for the food and agricultural sector. In particular, it has a proposal for a combined agriculture and land use sector that might have its own target for emissions reduction from 2030 onwards. We already know, of course, about the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategies, which establish indicative targets across a range of indicators: fertilizer, pesticide use, organic farming, use of antimicrobials, broadband coverage in rural areas, to mention a few. And it also promises initiatives, including a carbon farming initiative, which Christine has been talking about, and a legislative framework for sustainable food systems in 2023. And I think it might be just worth pausing to sort of reflect on what do we mean by a sustainable food system. For example, the FoodWise 2025 strategy was based on the concept of sustainable intensification. And the guiding principle was that the environmental protection and economic competitiveness would be considered equal and complementary, such that one would not be achieved at the expense of the other. But this, what I call side-by-side model, simply hasn't worked. We've seen production increase, but we've seen also increasing damage to the environment. And it's clear that we must operate within our environmental boundaries, whether these are biophysical boundaries, such as to do with nutrient cycles and water quality. They may be legal boundaries, such as the legal limits on ammonia emissions or the requirement to restore biodiversity. Or there may be ethical limits, such as, what is Ireland's maximum share of the global carbon budget that remains if we are to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees and hopefully even as low as 1.5 degrees increase over the pre-industrial levels. So it seems to me that a sustainable food system is one in which economic sustainability respects and is built on top of environmental sustainability. We need to ensure that the latter is the foundation for what we do in terms of the use of our land. We saw last week the announcement of the Climate Action Plan, and we already had earlier this year the adoption of the Climate Act, the amendment to the Climate Act, which set into Irish law the requirement to reduce our emissions by 51% over the period 2018 to 2030. The top line here, the blue line, shows you the trend in agricultural emissions. And you can see it roughly divides into 3 periods: a decade of growth, a decade when emissions were falling, and the most recent decade when emissions have increased again. And in fact, in 2018, agricultural emissions were about 14% above those in 1990. The action plan sets out a range of emission reductions. At the lower end, a reduction of 22% compared to that 2018 level. That's the orange line in the diagram, or a maximum of 30%, which is the gray line. And you can see that relative to what we have achieved before, these targets will be challenging to achieve. The yellow line shows you the emissions from what we call the LULUCF sector. So this is the land use and forest sector, which in Ireland is actually a net emitter of between 5 to 6 million tons of CO2 annually. So we have emissions from grasslands and from wetlands, offset, but not fully offset, by the sink in forests and in harvested wood products. Now, relating very much to what Christine was saying, because we have planted those forests some time in the past, and they will be coming to maturity and we will be cutting them, The actual baseline for LULUCF emissions is an increase from under 5 million tons at the moment to up to 7 million tons in 2030. And in fact, the EPA is warning that there could be new science which actually suggests that the emissions from forests planted on peatlands are much higher than what we have known to date. So even that 7 million tons may well prove to be an underestimate. The action plan sets out a reduction target of 4.6 million tons, so that's shown in the green line. And again, it's clear that it is a challenge which we have not yet achieved in the past. The Climate Action Plan sets out various measures by which it's intended to try to meet these targets. It builds for agriculture on the Ag Climatise 2020 plan, which in turn was based on the Teagasc marginal abatement cost curve and would require full and complete implementation of the measures identified by Teagasc by 2030. The plan actually identifies pathways which would achieve a reduction of between 3.6, 4.2 million tons out of the 5 to 7 million tons which the plan sees as necessary, with the remainder to be identified later, including diversification opportunities, carbon farming, and the use of feed additives. On the LULUCF side, the two main measures proposed are new afforestation, with an accounting finesse, if you like, which is interesting, and also reduced management intensity through water table management of up to 80,000 hectares of drained organic soils. What I think is interesting is that the action plan specifically states that the CAP strategic plan will be an integral delivery mechanism to achieve these climate ambitions, and that the ambitions will be aligned to the CAP's new green architecture. And we're going to examine the extent of that coherence in just a moment. So turning now to the new CAP. And it's based on a set of principles, a new delivery model that gives member states greater flexibility to address their specific needs. These needs have been identified in Ireland using a SWOT analysis and a needs assessment under the 3 general and the 9 specific objectives, which are set out in the CAP regulation and which you can see in the diagram on the right. So member states design interventions and set targets in their CAP strategic plan across both pillars of the CAP. And there will be a change in governance from a compliance-based approach. So the idea is to move away from sort of simply blindly following rules and regulations set down at the Brussels level to a more performance-based approach. So you set your targets, it's up to you to identify the measures to achieve those targets, and you will be evaluated on how well you are doing. Now, I've taken this slide from a presentation made by the department to the CAP Consultative Committee in September of this year, because it simply shows the timeline to reach the situation where we are submitting our draft strategic plan for approval to the Commission. So the state we've reached now is that last month the department issued its updated list of interventions following a public consultation. This will be evaluated, and in November it has to publish a strategic environmental assessment and an appropriate assessment. In other words, an assessment of the environmental impacts of the strategic plan. That will be available for public consultation. There may be some changes made to the plan in the light of that consultation. The plan then goes for approval to government and hopefully will be submitted to the Commission by the 1st of January of this year. So an awful lot to do within the next 6 weeks, if indeed that target is to be managed. there's going to be a large provision of finance to help achieve some of the targets in the strategic plan. In fact, the government has committed almost 10 billion euro over the 5 years, 2023 to 2027, from both EU CAP money and national co-financing. And the third column of figures on the graphic here shows the breakdown between Pillar 1, almost 6 billion euro, and Pillar 2, almost 4 billion euro. And what I've done is to try to ask, how does this compare with what farmers received under the current CAP? And I take that as the 2014-2020 CAP. Of course, that's a 7-year period, and we're looking now at a CAP over 5 years. So in the second column of figures, I've scaled back the current CAP to make it comparable to a 5-year period. So when we compare by pillar, we see that the new CAP will have slightly less funding available for the Pillar 1 envelope, a shortfall of a little less than 2%. But significantly more funding for rural development programs, an increase of about 30%, in fact. So overall, there will be around 9% additional funding to support farming during the period of the new CAP, as compared to what we have been used to under the current CAP. Of course, that funding is in nominal terms, but I tried to put it in context by suggesting that if we compare it to what we would expect the factor income in agriculture to be over that period of around 20 billion, and family farm income of around 15 billion. So that 10 billion injection into rural areas in those 5 years is indeed very significant. So how is that money going to be spent? Well, if we look at the distribution of the Pillar 1 direct payments, first of all, we see that just over 60%, the blue panel there in the chart, will be spent on what will be called the basic income support for sustainability. This is effectively the replacement for the basic payment. Another 25% will be spent on eco schemes. 10% will be spent on the redistributive payment, which is also called front loading, so the payment on the first 30 hectares of a farm, and smaller amounts then for young farmer support and for sectoral interventions and the coupled payment for protein crops. So what we see here is an attempt to bring about a fairer and more targeted distribution of direct payments. And that begins with an extended definition of what is an eligible hectare for payment. And that's going to be extended to allow for non-agricultural features such as landscape features, areas committed for biodiversity or climate reasons, and importantly, areas where up to 30% of a parcel consists of beneficial features for water, for environment, for climate, and so on. So that is going to address a major criticism of the current CAP, that farmers have had to clear areas that are potentially valuable habitats in order to ensure that their land qualifies for payment. Hopefully, that will not be the case in the new CAP. And just to highlight that, of course, area under grant-aided forestry will continue to be eligible for CAP payments as at present. Now, these basic income payments will still be linked to entitlements. So you need your eligible hectares, but you will also need to hold an entitlement to activate the payment on those hectares. But in the case of the new redistributive payment, the new eco scheme and the young farmer payments, these will in future be linked to the number of eligible hectares that you hold and not the number of entitlements. Payments will, of course, be limited to active farmers, so there will be a minimum stocking rate requirement, although the department has indicated it intends to eliminate the so-called negative list, such as airports and golf courses and so on. Importantly, payments will be effectively capped at €66,000 per farm. That's the maximum that any farm will get in the new cap. And there's no provision for deduction of labor costs, which is an option that was allowed under the cap regulation. Under the regulation, there is a requirement that we move further towards greater internal convergence. So that's the leveling up of entitlement values. And this will see all entitlement values raised to at least 85% of the planned average amount, where the current minimum is just 60%. In figures, the current average entitlement value, including the greening payment, is around €245. In future, the average value will be €165. That seems a significant drop, but let's wait a moment because there are things that will add to that. And the minimum value will be €145. So the first thing that can be added is, of course, the redistributive payment, which will add €30 to the value of an entitlement automatically on the first 30 hectares. And then if all farmers participate in eco-schemes, the unit value of an eco-scheme payment will add a further €63 per hectare. So effectively, for many farmers, you'll be able to add up to, let's say, €93 to that 165 basic entitlement value. And indeed, if not all farmers participate, let's suppose that 85% of farmers participate, then the value of the eco-scheme payment could indeed increase even further to €74. We turn now to the green architecture of the new cap, and I think everybody is familiar with the three levels. There is the enhanced conditionality, which all farmers in receipt of cap payments must observe to be compliant. There will be the new eco schemes in Pillar 1 and the continuation of agri-environment climate schemes in Pillar 2. So turning first of all to look at the changes that will occur in terms of conditionality, the new name for cross-compliance. And as before, this will cover a range of statutory management requirements, the legal obligations that farmers must observe, and in addition, a number of good agricultural and environmental condition standards. Under the SMR heading, the only change really will be in compliance with the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, which already is effectively operated in Ireland, but it will mean that a farmer who is not in compliance could risk the loss of some of their payment in that event. Perhaps more significant is the upcoming review of the Nitrates Directive, because the Nitrates Directive is one of the SMRs that is covered in conditionality. And that sets the baseline of requirements. It's only if farmers go beyond that baseline that they become eligible for payments under eco schemes or under the agri-environment climate schemes in Pillar 2. So that, in a sense, that review, if it changes the current requirements, could raise the level before farmers will actually get paid for doing more. There is, in terms of the GAIAC standards, there's a new GAIAC 2 on protection of wetland and peatland. And I understand the department's intention here is that this will prohibit ploughing on wetlands and peatlands. And of course, there will be a need for maps so that farmers know whether they have land that is covered under this GAIAC obligation or not. And the other major change is the fact that the greening obligations are now incorporated into the conditionality baseline. So GAIAC 1 is the maintenance of permanent pasture. GAIAC 7 is the crop diversification, but extended to include crop rotation. GAIAC 8 is the old or the current ecological focus areas on arable land. which the department intends to interpret as a minimum of 4% non-productive area on all agricultural land, so including grazing land and grassland farms for the first time. And GAIAC 9 is then the continuation of the ban on ploughing environmentally sensitive grassland in Natura 2000 sites. Eco schemes are the big novelty and the big unknown, I think, in the new CAP. The department has suggested 5 agricultural practices that would qualify for eco scheme payments, where a farmer would be required to adopt any 2 of these. So an increase in non-productive areas beyond the 4%, which is the minimum obligatory requirement. So if you have up to 7%, you would get paid for that additional 3%. Extensive livestock production, limiting chemical nitrogen input, planting of native trees, or the use of GPS-controlled fertilizer spreader. Now, in thinking about, why has the department suggested these 5 measures in particular? There are a number of design constraints around eco schemes. First of all, it's going to be an annual scheme. That means that farmers can opt in or out from year to year. You're not committed to remain in the scheme if you enroll in the first year of the new CAP. But there are also only small, despite some small flexibilities, the department must ensure that the eco scheme budget, remember it's a minimum, it's 25% of the total Pillar 1 envelope. The department must ensure that that budget is spent each year, because otherwise the money is lost. We simply don't draw it down from Brussels. So it's different to the agri-environment climate measure, where you can carry that money over to following years in the rural development program. So given those design elements, the department wants schemes that would allow effectively all farmers to participate. And at the same time, the agricultural practices must allow the department to administer and control the scheme within the same calendar year. So farmers will apply in March and the payment will be received in November. So that constrains fairly considerably the range of schemes which potentially can be considered. The payments under the eco scheme will be based, according to the department, on the additional costs incurred and the income foregone. But it also appears, and here I'm trying to understand the literature that has been made available, it appears that the payment will be a flat rate per hectare, regardless of which 2 schemes a farmer chooses. So all of the 5 practices seem to be weighted equally. And if a farmer were only to adopt one of the 5 practices, the suggestion is that they would only be eligible for half of the per hectare payment. But the payment per hectare will also be impacted by the expected uptake of the scheme, as we have seen before. If there are fewer farmers that enroll, then the average payment per hectare is going to be higher for those who do enroll. And of course, the big unknown is, what actually will be the environmental gain from these eco schemes? And I think we need to wait to see more detail on how they will be designed, and also to look at how they operate over time. Turning now to the Pillar 2, and this is a complicated slide. All I really want to do is to highlight the significance of spending on the agri-environment climate measures. And here I include the organic farming scheme. So around 45% of the entire Pillar 2 budget will be directed to environmental and climate objectives. And indeed, if we include some of the livestock schemes, for example, the suckler carbon efficiency program, which also is intended to give rise to climate benefits, it's possible to argue that over half of the total budget will be spent on environmental and climate objectives. Well, let's look at the actual agri-environment climate scheme itself, which I think is actually one of the the more exciting and innovative elements of the proposed CAP strategic plan. It's going to consist of two elements which are equally funded, a general scheme and a cooperative scheme. It's expected to involve around 50,000 farmers. The department estimates the area covered will be around 330,000 hectares, which seems to me on the small side, given that we have 50,000 farmers enrolled, but there may be an explanation for that. The general scheme will consist of a suite of measures, but focused on priority assets and priority actions. And access to the scheme will be determined through a ranking and selection process, with priority access provided to organic farmers, to farmers with priority assets on their land. These could be Natura 2000 areas, they could be water areas or whatever, and farmers who agree to undertake specific priority actions. Payment will be based on a hybrid model, so both prescription-based, so payment for the specific practices which you undertake, but also results-based measures. And there is reference to the introduction of a farm sustainability plan as part of the overall scheme. The other element is this cooperative scheme, which will take a landscape approach. So farmers in areas identified by the department as having higher environmental priorities will be able to participate in specific cooperation actions. So these will build on top of the general scheme. And the eligibility to participate in these will be clear from the application phase, where farmers' lands falling in the defined cooperation areas. That's where the department will define where they want these actions to take place. And if your farm partly or fully falls within such an area, then you will be able to avail of these additional supports. And importantly, any additional bespoke farm or landscape measures required will be implemented in these cooperative schemes with the assistance of a local project team at local level. So I think what we see reflected here is the very successful experience from the EIP projects that have been running up till now. I couldn't pass by without saying something about the organic farming scheme. The minister already referred to that in his opening address, where the aim is to increase the area under organics to reach the 7.5 target. Support will be provided as an area-based payment over a maximum of 5 years, with the value of the payment based on the additional costs incurred and income forgone that farming to organic standards incurs. Significantly, the rate of aid is going to vary across farming sectors in line with the strategy for the development of the organic sector. Higher rates will be payable for horticultural operations, tillage, and for dairy operations, all of which are strongly in deficit. So my concluding slide, I tried to draw together some of the key messages from this presentation. So farmers clearly will be interested in what is happening to direct payments. And the new direct payments model will redistribute payments, first of all, from higher value to lower value entitlement holders, and also from larger to smaller farms, thanks to this redistributive payment. But I would say that the choices that the department has made will minimize the changes while observing the minimum EU requirements. So it would have been possible to have gone further along both of those axes, but this is the choice which the department has made. Then turning to the green architecture, I've emphasized that conditionality will set the baseline for the voluntary eco schemes and the agri-environment climate measures, and recognizing that some of the new requirements are actually the requirements that were in place already for the greening payment. Nonetheless, I think there probably is a slight raising of standards, and I've highlighted that the revision of the nitrates directive could also add to that. The big unknown is how these new eco schemes will work. They're novel, they're annual schemes, but that has the advantage that if it turns out that one or two are not attractive to farmers, or they don't appear to be giving us that environmental benefit that we need, they could potentially be altered over the course of the plan. We don't have to wait until 2028 to make those changes. Looking at the proposed new agri-environment and climate measure, it's very clear that the new scheme builds on the learnings from the pilot results-based schemes that we've run in Ireland and the various EIP projects, and I think that is really very something to be very pleased about, that the department has taken that step. We need to know a lot more about how the scheme will work in practice, but as I say, for me, it's one of the more exciting and innovative parts of the new CAP plan. I hope, and I think it will, that the strategic plan will specify impact targets so that we can see if the plan is delivering and to monitor whether changes need to be made. Listeners will be aware that the Commission has strongly recommended that member states set targets for some of the indicators set out in the Farm to Fork strategy. It's not a legal obligation, but nonetheless, the Commission is strongly asking for that to happen. But I think already, for example, in the Climate Action Plan and in what the Minister has already announced, we do see targets for reductions in emissions, for increasing the organic area, for reductions in fertilizer use, and so on. So that will allow us to see whether the interventions that have been proposed actually deliver the needed changes on the ground. And I suppose the unanswered question at this stage is, given the reliance on the strategic plan to deliver the hugely ambitious emissions reduction targets which agriculture is faced, both directly and in the land use sector, are we actually doing enough, or will more be needed over the course of the plan to actually achieve those objectives? So Philip, let me thank you and thank the listeners, and I'm very happy to take any questions from the chat or afterwards that people might like to raise. So thank you for listening to me.
Indeed, thank you very much for a really comprehensive overview in a very, very short space of time there, Professor Matthews. There are a number of questions that have come in that I want to put to you straight away. I have two of my own from a big sort of picture point of view, please, because the question that I'm hearing at the moment again and again and again in the context of the climate action plan that farmers are being asked to sign up to is, they'll say, yeah, look, we'll do it if Brussels will compensate us, but our experience of the last couple of years is that we cannot look with any great confidence to Brussels to compensate us properly, because we have just seen incomes going down and down and down in that time. Do you have the impression, or is it your analysis of the proposals that you've set out there, that farmers will do all right out of it, that they will be properly compensated for taking action on the action plan?
Well, I think the first point to make is that, you know, there is overall more money on the table, at least in terms of the CAP budget itself. So that's an important starting point. I also highlighted, and indeed Christine referred to this in her presentation, the role of the sort of carbon farming initiative. Now, what's significant about that, and you know, I think there's still a lot of practical questions to be answered around this, which hopefully the Commission will address in its communication, which I understand should be published sometime before the end of this year. But assuming that these sort of practical issues can be addressed, the idea behind carbon farming is not only that this might be something that might be paid for under the CAP. So we, for example, we see as very definitely signaled as part of the cooperative scheme in the agri-environment climate measure. This is going to fund some of the re-wetting the 80,000 hectares of drained organic soils that the Climate Action Plan sees as necessary to re-wet. Some of that will be funded from the CAP. But there is also the potential for a market in these carbon credits, exactly as in Australia, where the private sector may be willing to purchase these credits in order to offset some of their, for example, historical emissions. Companies like Microsoft or Vesta, the Windows people, they have a commitment to offset all of their historic emissions since the company was founded in 1941. So there is the potential for private funding in addition to what is there in the CAP funding. Okay. So those would be 2 points that I would put on the table that I think are some grounds for optimism.
And Alan, the redistributive payments, they look on the face of it to be very progressive. Do you think that the impact there is going to be beneficial for smaller farmers and maybe not so good for the larger farmer?
Well, I mean, that is, of course, the intention that some of the funding be shifted to smaller farmers with the redistributive payment. The department has done some modelling on this. My understanding is that around about 75% of farmers will actually achieve a small uplift as a result, and 25% of farmers will see a drop in their entitlement values as a result. So that gives you some order of magnitude of winners and losers. But that is the deliberate objective of the redistribution policy. And
the elephant in the room from the point of view of the national conversation here is one that doesn't appear to be addressed in the analysis that you presented us there with, and that's destocking. Does the possibility of compensation or payment for reduction of herd size arise in individual aspects of the programme, like the suckler carbon efficiency programme, or is it just absent from this document and therefore not on the political agenda?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first point we need to make in any discussion around this is that what we want to achieve from a climate point of view is a reduction in emissions. Questions of animal numbers come into the picture only if we cannot achieve sufficient reduction through technological and management options. And it's clear that we are only scratching the surface on some of those management options. I mean, if you listen to what Christine had to say, we're far from implementing many of the ideas that she put forward. In terms of herd numbers, I would point out that in the early 1980s, Philip, we had about, I think, 3.9 million sheep in the country. And then the European Commission introduced, you might remember, a headage payment. And this led to a huge expansion in sheep numbers. The number actually went up to 8 million. And of course, extensive environmental damage on hillsides as a result. So that policy was changed, and our sheep numbers are now down to 3.9 million. So they've halved over that recent period. And I don't hear anybody complaining, that this is somehow, destroyed sheep farming. It was simply an untenable policy in the first place. And what we need to highlight is that we have to farm within our environmental boundaries, and we're not doing that at the moment. The reason for that, of course, is that although we are aware of the environmental damage that unrestrained expansion has led to in terms of increased emissions, in terms of water quality, in terms of loss of biodiversity, but there's no price, there's no signal to individual farmers. And the point I made in that Irish Times article that you referred to was that when a farmer goes to their bank and seeks a loan to either convert to dairying or to expand dairying, they'll go with their budgets, they'll have their milk check forecast, they'll have their expected expenditure on feed, on fertilizer, the cost of additional housing, but the cost of that environmental impact is not included. So I think we really need to think of a way of incentivizing farmers. We need to put a price on those emissions, whereby farmers that are emitting more than the average will pay into some kind of a pool, and those who are emitting less or indeed sequestering carbon, using the potential techniques that Christine has referred to, would actually get rewarded. The Chagos-Mack curve has many interventions which are actually a win-win for the farmer's bottom line. They actually have a negative cost, yet they're not being implemented, for various reasons. Inertia, people are used to doing what they do and don't really see the need to change. So I think we need to be, a little bit more deliberate in the signals we send to farmers. And then I think we will really see action on the ground, because farmers are up to it. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that in the coming 5 days.
That's quite enough of my own questions. Let's move on to questions from people attending the conference remotely. And I'm also going to turn to you guys, the few of you who are here, if you want to get in on it, please. Ned McCarthy asks you, Professor, Christine Jones said that 58% of carbon is stored at depths of greater than 10 centimetres. Is this figure being measured in Ireland? How do we know what our net emissions are?
Again, a very good question, and although I'm not au fait with all of the details, but I am aware that Chagos has now established an agricultural soil centre. I can't quite remember the name they've given to it, but there is, I think, going to be much greater focus on measuring soil carbon content and composition and so on in the future. So I think this is only good news for farmers. We should have been doing it, of course, before now, but better late than never.
Marie, excuse me, I don't know which, Marie Comerford says, Professor Mathis, would you say a little bit more, please, on what comprises evaluation of implementation of the CAP regulations and how it's going to be monitored?
The idea behind the new CAP is that we will monitor member state performance at the EU level through a set of performance indicators. So the Commission will step back, if you like, from monitoring individual farmers. Of course, member states will still need to do that. But the Commission will effectively move to monitoring member states on a basis of, as I say, performance indicators. So in the CAP regulation, there's a whole list of indicators that member states have to report on. They will only report every second year, but there was a proposal initially that it should be an annual reporting exercise. And if it turns out that a particular intervention is off track, so that let's say enrollment is much less than expected, then the Commission has the ability to say to this member state, well, what's your plan to come back on track? The big problem that I see with the regulation is that the indicators are not necessarily the most relevant indicators. And I think we find national administration spending a lot of time trying to devise and work out indicators which maybe aren't going to tell us an awful lot. Because at the end of the day, what we really need to know is, are these interventions working on the ground? Is water quality improving? Are emissions falling? Are habitats improving in quality, and so on? So we need to measure those impact indicators. And as I say, that's not part of the regulation, but I'm really pleased to when I read the department's plan, to see that we are setting indicators. I beg your pardon. We are setting targets for ourselves. Now, we can then move on to the debate of whether these targets are sufficient. Are they ambitious enough? The reduction in fertilizer use, for example, is much less than the 50% reduction that is suggested in the farm to fork strategy. But still, at least the department is setting targets, and that will allow us to monitor the progress or the lack of progress that we make over the plan period.
Here's a question from Denise Boothman that I suspect most farmers feel that up until now they've only got blah, blah, blah type answers, to borrow a phrase. She asks, who owns the carbon sequestration credits that farmers will have in their soil? And I'd add my own supplementary to that. If they are to be credited for what is being sequestered, who then owns the debits or has to pay the debits for what's being emitted from organic soils?
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the practical questions which I would hope the Commission will provide some, initial answers to when it comes forward with this carbon farming initiative. Obviously, the specific issue of organic soils and the very significant emissions when they are drained is something which affects a relatively small number of northern European member states. So it's Ireland, it's Scotland, a little bit in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Finland, and so on, where we have these organic soils. Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question, and I don't have any off the cuff answer to it. But
you're just going to contribute to the blah blah blah. Is that what you're telling us, Professor?
No. Well, I'm hoping that Philip, that we'll get at least the framework for analysis in what the Commission comes forward with in its communication, which, as I say, is promised at least before the end of this year. So within the next 6 weeks, we may be a little bit clearer about what to expect.
Somewhere in Glasgow, Greta Thunberg is tut-tutting right now. I'm going to hand over the mic for 1 second here to Sean McGlone, who has a couple of questions to throw at you himself. Sean.
Thanks very much, Professor Matthews. Yeah, 2 quick questions. One, in the schemes, agroforestry, it didn't necessarily jump out at me. Is it somewhere in the schemes that, because it's probably one of the big bonus areas that farmers could contribute with, but unfortunately, because its classification as forestry land has kept most people out of it?
Yeah, I mean, Sean, I'm a bit reluctant to move into the specifics because, first of all, the department's documents so far, the most recent update of the CAP strategic plan released last month, is still a very high-level document. So, for example, you'll have seen that one of the practices, the 5 practices for eco schemes, will be planting of native trees. Now, potentially that could be agroforestry, but that we don't have as yet any further detail on how the department is going to interpret that. And similarly, if you look at the general scheme, for example, for the agri-environment climate scheme, agroforestry is certainly mentioned as one of the potential measures that would be funded under the scheme, but the priority that it's given both by the department and by individual farmers, because there will be a sort of menu approach, remains to be seen. So it's certainly given greater emphasis than we would have seen in the past, but very hard to tell just from what we know of the documentation. Maybe when Jack Nolan gets a chance to talk later this afternoon, he may be able to add something, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, on this. Yeah.
Okay, and thanks very much for that. The other question, and I don't know if I've interpreted it accurately, but you mentioned the wetland areas of 85,000 hectares, I think. Now, I take it that includes what would be part utilisable agricultural land as well, so that there'll be a lot of farmers are probably worried out there that, definitely in the west of Ireland, that if their land that they're currently grazing is classified completely as wetland, will it mean that they'll have to remove livestock as well? As the ploughing is less of an issue, I think, but the grazing element is probably going to be a consideration.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sean. There are 2 issues here. One is the GAIAC standard, okay, which is the GAIAC 2, with this new GAIAC, which is protection of wetlands and peatlands. So, we have around about 335,000 hectares of organic soils in the country. The department hasn't indicated yet how much of that area, if indeed all of that area, will be somehow classified. But let's be clear, the obligation that it is considering under the GAIAC standard is the prohibition on ploughing. You know, one might have expected that there might have been a prohibition on future drainage of that land, for example, if you want to remain eligible for cap payments, but you know, that hasn't been mentioned. So the other quite separate intervention is then the re-wetting envisaged as part of the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. And you know, I think it's very important to highlight here that this would be a voluntary scheme. Nobody would be required to engage in it. The hope would be that the funding the department will make available, you know, will be sufficiently attractive that farmers would see it in their interests to participate. And, you know, from the way I read the documentation, the department doesn't envisage this land being taken completely out of production. It talks about reduced management intensity through water table management. So obviously, if farmers undertake to reduce stocking rates, you know, through this re-wetting process, they would expect and I think will be given full compensation for that. But it will be that will be on an entirely voluntary basis.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, there's a large number of questions there, which I'm actually thinking at this point are probably better off addressed to Jack Nolan a little bit later on in the conference rather than to you. So, sorry to let him know that I'm going to land all of that on him later on. But just before I let you go, we're also here with John Geraghty from WIT. I think you had a question, John.
Yeah, sorry. Excellent, Alan. Really, really excellent review on the new CAP and all of the different measures. With regard to the AEC scheme, the Agri-Environment and Climate Measure Initiative, we had a REAP initiative earlier this year. And I actually had some farmer clients that participated in that scheme, but I also had a number of applicants that were excluded from that scheme. And interestingly, the clients that were excluded from that scheme on the basis of the selection process were larger, more intensive farmers. Okay. Now, the issue is that if we have an agri-environment and climate measure scheme, we need to show benefits in terms of the environment, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of water management, for example, and also climate resilience. And if the selection process is such that it's going to exclude some of the farmers that could potentially deliver most in terms of measurable improvements and maybe reductions in emissions, is it really going to be that exciting and that innovative?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there's a limited budget, that implies that not all farmers who might want to enroll will be accepted. So then we fall back on the selection criteria that the department sets down, and you know, the way in which those criteria are interpreted by the relevant decision makers. So, you know, you give an example of where in practice you weren't fully satisfied with the way that decision making was made. But at least on paper, it seems to me the elements are there to make the right decision. So, you know, it's clear that the focus will be on selecting farmers with these. Well, first, organic farmers are automatically going to be enrolled if they wish. Mm-hmm. Then you have those farmers with so-called priority assets. So these are environmental assets that need protection or quality improvement. And then you have those farmers who are willing to undertake priority actions. So ways in which they would actually farm and have beneficial environmental outcomes. So, you know, that seems to me, hopefully the farms that apply will be ranked in a way that actually ensures that, you know, we as taxpayers get the best value for money from that scheme. And then the other aspect is this geographical targeting, which will relate to the cooperative element of the scheme. And remember that the funding is equally balanced between the two elements of the scheme. So here the department, and again, we don't know what areas of the country are going to be identified, but one would assume that they will identify areas where there are these severe environmental pressures, and they can include these areas with high stocking rates and a large dairy element, and that so these cooperative projects can focus on the areas where again they give the greatest environmental benefit. But in principle, it seems to look very good on paper, but we have to see how this is going to work out in practice.
Professor Alan Matthews, thank you very much for that. Proof, once again, that anybody who is prepared to read and explain the entire CAP in such a short space of time just goes to underline the truth in the old saying, not all heroes wear capes. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Coming up after this short break, what is, for my money, one of the most fascinating areas of human health research.